All right, everybody, welcome to Creation Watch. It's time to explore some Abrahamic folklore today, ladies and gentlemen. Last week we kind of branched away from the old Abrahamics, but today we are going to return and dive right back into it because there's plenty to talk about, right? There's plenty of things to cover on the subject, and we're never going to run out of these guys because we have wonderful organizations like ICR here to provide us with the quintessential and most important dunking material that we could ever ask for. And today is no difference. I promised that we weren't going to move away from dragons if you stuck around for Creation Watch, or move away from monsters if you stuck around for Creation Watch. And I'm keeping my promise because today's coverage of ICR is going to be, is there any truth to the dragon legends? So here we go, my beauties and bees. Let's dive right into ICR's folklore.
What's at stake
there
is
if
we see depictions and carvings and whatnot and historical written descriptions of dragons and they end up being real, and if those match what we see from fossils, then that totally reshapes our view of history. That sort of flies in the face of this idea that the fossils were deposited millions of years before humans supposedly evolved, and instead it brings these dinosaurs right into mixing with humans in human history.
Right.
Now that's just anathema to the secular mind to even think in those terms, which is why they don't look at the evidence that we're talking about today. Because why examine evidence that refutes the way you believe about the past?
So this guy's going to teach us why dragons are real. Are you guys ready? Because after this, we're all going to be like dragon believers. And from dragon believers, it's only one step away from unicorns, because that's biblical.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creation Podcast, the show where we discuss science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Trey.
Science that confirms Scripture, and we're talking about dragons, so keep those things in mind.
And today with me, I have Dr. Brian Thomas, ICR research scientist and paleobiochemist.
Paleobiochemist.
Glad to have you on the show today, Dr. Thomas.
Pleasure's mine.
All right. So today, normally we talk about science. Today we're actually going to be talking a little bit about history, but it's tangentially related as we discuss dragon.
Why is their background music so loud? I feel like I'm supposed to dance to. Oh, I was at a dance party last night, so I got my dancing groove on, and now my shoulder's a little sore, but that's okay. I love dancing. But is it just me, or is this background music like incredibly loud for how high the volume of audio is for their conversation?
Legends. Of course, dragon legends are across the world. We hear them from all continents. Let's start.
You see, I screened this with just my computer speakers, not my headphones too, so it might just be me with my headphones.
Start with a simple question. Are dragons real?
Is a present tense verb.
Yes.
So are dragons alive today is kind of what I'm hearing in that question, and I don't know of any. But if you were to ask me, were dragons real,
Hey, Maya.
I might have to say probably
Hey,
so
Tina.
in certain places and at certain times.
Okay. Well, today we
Ruby.
have this word dinosaur. And I know that the word dinosaur.
You see, dragons are dinosaurs? Is that the direction we're taking things today? That dragons are dinosaurs? Let's find out.
Or has not existed forever. Could you tell us where that word came from?
Oh, wow. I get to be pop quizzed on this show.
Yes.
Oh, man.
Let's see if he gets it right.
1842 is the invention of the word
Okay.
dinosaur. Terrible lizard, referring to fossils.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but the word dragon, of course, has been in European languages for a lot longer than that.
Right.
Long before the word dinosaur was invented. So that's why, for example, we see the word dragon in some of the earlier Bible translations, translating the Hebrew Tanim.
So dragons are in the Bible. I yield to that. Yes, your folklore requires dragons to exist as physical animals that interact with humans and interacted with humans up into historical time. So your folklore does require that. However, subfossil evidence of dinosaurs, of non-avian dinosaurs, I should specify, are few and far between. But we're going to see what kind of evidence these guys have to show us, right?
They used those earlier translators used the word dragon as though it was a real creature, or a real class of creatures, or a type of maybe reptilian.
I don't doubt that they believed it was a real type of creature. I'm sure between lore from the Nile Valley of Nile crocodiles, which are about as close to a dragon as you're gonna get, but also giant varanids. There's Nile monitor lizards, and of course enormous snakes on either side. Because you get into India, there's giant pythons. You get into Africa, there's giant pythons. So every direction there's lore about giant snakes and giant crocodiles, giant lizards. All these, and maybe even traders come through bringing and have a caged monitor lizard or crocodile that you get to see. You're like, oh, this is just the baby, right? Just something along those lines. Like, oh yeah. So the folklore of the Middle East of dragons is definitely built on the notion of giant reptilian creatures from far off lands. But sometimes they'd seen them, sometimes they hadn't. Yeah.
Type of creature.
Right. And so what we see here when we talk about dragons is they couldn't have used a word that they didn't have, right?
Oh, so if someone were to say, if dinosaurs are in the Bible, then why doesn't the word dinosaur occur in the Bible?
Right.
The answer would be because there's a long history of translating the word tanim into the word dragon and different words before the word dinosaur was even invented. But if I were to translate the Bible, I might insert.
Well, sometimes they translate it as like wild things or creatures of the wild or something like that. Am I mistaken? Or maybe it's cockatrice that they translate it to in some versions of the Bible.
The word dinosaur in a few places.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. And I know that we live in a world where the fantasy genre is rampant, and we see dragons in all sorts of movies and books and TV shows. And so if you're telling me that dragons were real in certain places and in certain times, I guess my next question to you would be, do those dragons line up with the dragons that we see today in media?
Oh, the historical dragons?
Yes.
In other words, what
Historical dragons. The historical dragons, not the fictional ones, the historical ones, you guys. Got to differentiate that.
creatures were our ancestors referring to when they used the word dragon?
Right.
And do those creatures, match sort of what we see in movies and kids
Right.
shows? And I'd say no, doesn't match.
Right.
But that's based on information about what our ancestors were looking at.
Well, usually even modern kids shows are based on some version of mythology, right? Of folklore. There's different types of dragons, though. Dragon is a very broad term, and we apply it to a lot of different things that may or may not be related in folklore. They're going to talk about that a little bit here, too, and I get to pare it down because they make a lot of inferences that this is the same phenomena, and it's just not the way that these creatures are depicted and who they decide that they're going to loop in under dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we get that information? Well, they drew pictures.
Right.
They carved images of what they were of what possibly they were looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they actually wrote descriptions of what they saw and witnessed.
Now, I do not dispute that there were fossil beds that were discovered by prehistoric people, by Bronze Age people, by Middle Age people, by early modern era people that gave fuel to monster lore and to dragon lore. I don't doubt that at all. Dragon teeth are almost universally dinosaur teeth, right? or teeth of some other prehistoric large animal. I've seen Gigantopithecus teeth even be referred to as dragon teeth.
And so those are the records that we go to. That's why we're interested in this type of history, is because there's something to look at that gives us, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Right.
There are pictures to see.
Yeah, people found fossils and didn't know what to make of them. Sure, I'm with you. I don't disagree here, and decided to reconstruct what they thought these creatures looked like in life, in their art.
Now, when we do this, you have to be careful, because it turns out that most of the depictions, whether it's carvings or drawings, or we call it text illuminations, which is like drawing inside of a book. Most of the depictions of what we might call, or they might have called, a dragon, don't match anything we know from fossils. In other words, they don't match any particular dinosaur or any particular other
True.
extinct reptile. In other words, they're just a generalized, it looks reptilian.
Right.
And so either we haven't yet discovered the fossil that matches that particular drawing or carving or whatever, or the artist back then was just trying to portray a general, hey, it's a big scary thing,
It's a monster.
It's a monster. And so there's a real monster. And so anyway, but those are interesting, but the really interesting ones, descriptions, carvings, artwork, the really interesting ones.
So now we're going to get into some of the artwork and carvings and stuff. Obviously, old hat. I know I've been over this stuff before, but if they're going to keep bringing it up, I'm going to keep pushing back against it. You feel me, Hive? You feel me on this? So we got to go back through these things again. Have we done a dozen times? I know. And I'm sorry if you're sick of hearing about it. Maybe the people who are new here, though, haven't heard about it before. We're going to look at some carvings.
Are those that match specific anatomical features of extinct creatures that we only know from fossils.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you? I assume you do. You are an expert after all. Do you have any examples of any of those things that match what we know today from the fossil record?
Well, I'm not an expert in the technical sense, but I've just been reading up. Like you, have an interest.
I'm an expert because I'm a cryptozoologist, guys. So let me step in here and have my way with your dragon lore. Let Mama show you how it's done.
In this topic.
Yes.
So
because I am a nerd. Dragons are awesome.
Yeah. so
I am a nerd and dragons are awesome. That's why I keep talking about them too, babe. I get it.
So fire-breathing, flying dragons, I don't see any historical evidence of that. In the little kid shows, they have this big fat dragon with teeny tiny wings. Well, that's not anatomically responsible.
Wouldn't be able to fly anyway, right?
You leave Ord alone.
Right. Yeah. So that's not what we're talking about when we say the word dragon. So let's just say for the rest of this episode, when we use the word dragon, we're referring to an actual animal.
Yes.
I'll get all Zach and Wheezy on you.
That once interacted with our ancestors and that they came up with a word for it.
Sure. Yeah.
And by the way, like you said, every culture around the globe, you said every continent, but it's hundreds of cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And each of these cultures, each language has its own word for big, scary reptilian monster.
No, they don't. And you're making it up. And you're making it up because they have chimeras.
Sometimes it's just the word monster. Of course, dragon, but in China, it's the word long. And they have...
Which is nothing like a dragon. A long has feathers like a bird. Its body's kind of serpentine, but more based on an oarfish. And its face is kind of horse-like or maybe like a dog, but it's definitely a chimera of different features, not a dragon. All right, I put that in song for some reason. I don't know why.
So they have a word for dragon. In all different, even the North American, Native American languages, they all have words that
for snakes and serpents, for lizards, for alligators, for crocodiles, for other beasts of the wild. But do they have a word for dragon? Or do they have a word for something that you're pretending is a dragon? Let's find out.
So why do you have a word to describe a thing if it's not really a thing to describe?
Right. It's all over the place. How did everyone just randomly come up with this fictional creature to insert into its own history, right?
Right. And I guess if I can just sort of zoom out real quick, what's at stake is if we see depictions and carvings and whatnot and historical written descriptions of dragons and they end up being real, and if those match what we see from fossils, then that totally reshapes our view of history.
But you just said they don't match what we see from fossils. You just said that. The horse face thing has always weirded me out. About a long, yeah, longs look weird. They are weird looking. They're supposed to be weird looking chimera, but only we call them dragons as colonizers, the Westerners. We're like, oh yeah, that's a dragon. To them, it's something totally different. It's a spiritual, elemental creature that, like a god, not really a god though, but like an ancient entity or force of the universe or whatever it's supposed to be in Chinese folk tradition. But it's not a dragon. It's not a big monster. That's just colonizer language,
right? So that
and I say that I'm a colonizer, right? I am. I come from a long line of colonizers. I'm living on colonized land right now, and I say that, recognizing that that's the case. But we need to keep things in perspective for this matter, especially when it comes to Native American people, because they had mostly like feathered serpents and things like that, which again are chimeras. In Australia, the natives there had rainbow serpents. That's what they're all trying to tie together as dragons in this narrative, and it's just not the case.
That sort of flies in the face of this idea that the fossils were deposited millions of years before humans supposedly evolved, and instead it brings these dinosaurs up right into mixing with humans in human history.
Right.
Now that's just anathema to the secular mind to even think in those terms.
Dr. Tapioca Weasels asks about breathing fire, and I imagine if they bring it up, we're also going to see pictures of a bombardier beetle, and I'll have to point everybody to Tony Reed's wonderful video on bombardier beetles that I did do a little coverage on. So,
which is why they don't look at the evidence that we're talking about today. Because why examine evidence that refutes the way you believe about the past?
Because we all know that dinosaurs/dragons lived millions of years ago. There's no way that they encountered humans, right?
Well, yeah, so...
Yeah, because humans didn't live millions of years ago. Humans have only been around somewhere between 300 and 200 million years ago by the last estimate that I'm aware of. Of course, I'm willing to be corrected on those dates, but it was definitely not millions of years ago. The genus Homo may be millions of years old, if you want to consider that human. Well, we're going to have to unpack that with ICR, because I think there's a few things that they might disagree with me on when it comes to what falls into the genus Homo and what we should consider part of the human race. Now, when it comes to dragons, we're talking a whole nother ballgame.
So that's sort of a circular argument. They can't be actual dinosaurs that they drew, because dinosaurs had been long extinct.
Right.
Well, wait a minute.
Let's clarify again. Non-avian dinosaurs have been long extinct. There are still dinosaurs around today, theropods. Quite a few of them, and they're pretty diverse, and I eat them on occasion. I think you probably do too. So I think that saying dinosaurs are extinct millions of years, we need to be clear on our terminology there. But the non-avian dinosaurs definitely disappear from the fossil record at somewhere between 66 and or 66.5 and 65 million years ago or so. Somewhere in that little window of time. There's a line that says no more dinosaurs above this line. All the dinosaurs are below it. And that's what it shows. So if you're refuting that iridium layer and what it means, I'd like your explanation of what laid down that division.
Look at the evidence before dismissing it. See what the evidence actually shows. Because what it shows is, okay, so for example, we went to Carlisle Cathedral in the north of England. And in the floor of the cathedral is a rug. And if you ask, like my wife did very nicely, if you ask the rector, can you please move this rug so we can look at Bishop Bell's tomb in the floor? They buried their bishops in the floor of the cathedrals. I don't know why. This is a different culture.
A little odd. But
yeah. So if you do that, you can look at the beautiful brass artwork that decorated his tomb, under the floor there, and it's got a brass. It's really tiny, like a 1-inch thick brass band. It's like a rectangular shape that wraps around his tomb area, and along that long, skinny brass band, you've got carving, just carved in brass.
This stuff is funny to me. The carvings, the brass dinosaurs. So is the notion here that there were sauropods roaming Europe in the Middle Ages? That's my question. I want to explore that.
And you've got creatures that look familiar, like a pheasant, an eel, just regular, a fox, regular plants and animals, mostly animals. But then there's two creatures that are with long necks, and those necks are intertwined. And in fact, their legs go straight down. And I mean, they look like sauropod dinosaurs.
Right.
I mean, you look at them. You could take these images right off of this. It was made in like 1406. So way before the word dinosaur was ever invented. And even before the King James Version of the Bible was translated. This is really old. It's medieval, but you could take these images and plop them onto a children's book on dinosaurs and just turn the page like it was meant to be there. So
Again, Northern England. I don't want to stress this I want to stress this as much as I can. This is in Northern England. And this is depicting animals that would have been foreign, as he said, peacocks and things like that. Things that they would not have had a good depiction of, except for maybe in menageries, right? So there's a few animals that do some neck wrestling that could be depicted here. And hold on. Let me see.
Oh, spitting image. That's how spitting the image is. Have a spitting image of a dinosaur, sauropod. So sauropods were
dinosaurs
shaped like. I'm quizzing you here.
Oh man,
which ones were these?
Long necks.
These are long necks.
Yes.
Yeah. So it looks like two long necks intertwined, long tails, and then so we saw, and I'm noticing that one of the tails of these two.
Hold on. Let's look at this for a second here. So he's about to talk about this one having tail spikes, or alleging that it has tail spikes. But we're missing. I have no structure on the head. It's been worn away on both creatures. They do have long tails. They do have cloven hooves. Okay, that's an important feature to keep in mind. So these are artiodactyls, I would say. They have cloven hooves. They're neck wrestling. I want to say ridiculously bad camels. Again, this is depicting creatures from menagerie. Like you said, they had peacocks and things like that. So tropical animals that were generally kept in royalty or in fancy menageries at this time. They were imported from foreign lands, and only the elite got to get in and see them. But the lore about what was in there, or what had been in there, would be passed down through oral tradition. And the depiction of camels often suffers from people in Northern Europe trying to depict them. Even people in the Mediterranean, as the Bruegel's Suicide of Saul painting will often lend itself to the notion that there were sauropods in the northern part of Europe in the Middle Ages. It's a weird flex, right? It's a weird flex. Long neck. Yeah, and there's some tree stars over here. See them? Or underneath. You can't see them because they're behind the wall of text, but there's tree stars behind there if you need one.
What looked like maybe fighting sauropods. Mm-hmm. One of the tip of the tail, it's got bumps, and you can count them. Now, this has been walked on for hundreds of years before they covered it with a rug to protect it.
It looks to me like its tail is more like forked than... Anyway. Yeah.
Right. So all that tromping has worn down some of the etching of it. So, but it's easy to reconstruct and to get a full picture of what looked like two sauropods. It looked like that to me, anyways. Well, the tail's got 4 little spikes on it.
Because he's not an expert, though, in the traditional... What is it? Hold on, Maya shared it again. What did you say, sweetie? I'm not an expert in the technical sense. So, yeah, he's not an expert, but it looks like it to him.
So I thought to myself, are there examples in the fossil world of sauropod dinosaurs with tail spikes on the end of the long, skinny sauropod tail? And sure enough, in the 1990s, paleontologists uncovered Shunosaurus. For example, that's just one example. And it turns out that Shunosaurus had 4 tail spikes. And how many tail spikes did this one have in Carlisle Cathedral?
4.
Count them, 4. Yeah. So these are the kinds of anatomical details that suggest maybe they had firsthand knowledge, or maybe.
It sure would be awkward if, oh, hold on. Just a second.
Secondhand knowledge of some of the creatures that they were carving.
Right.
That's one example that really piques our interest.
And it's interesting to me that they knew of this in the 1400s, and then in the late 1900s, we find evidence that
Yeah, I'm just gonna say it'd be awkward if I just wanted to make sure I had the location right. If Shinosaurus lived on the other side of the planet from the UK, right? From the British Islands, that'd be awful awkward. Did they import them from China? Did they import these giant sauropods from China? Let's see how big is this guy? 36 foot long. 3 metric tons, and you're telling me they transported it from China to the UK. What kind of boat did they put that sucker on?
Corroborates what we already see back here, but then in the scientific community, that connection is just kind of ignored. What's going on there?
Well, over the course of centuries, you lose that knowledge, you lose the information.
Yeah.
So in other words, Grandpa saw a dragon. Well, then the next generation comes about. Well, I haven't seen a dragon. So great grandpa, we heard that he said that he saw a dragon, and then by the time you get to the 5th generation, it's like whatever.
Yeah. Who cares?
Well, it's probably more like when Grandpa was traveling in North Africa, he saw a big reptile in the water. When Grandpa was traveling in Northern Africa, he saw this giant reptile. When Grandpa was in Africa, he saw dragons. Did you know there's dragons that still exist in the far reaches of the world? That's how that works.
I don't even know who that is anymore.
Yeah, who is that? Who even is that? I mean, who knows anything about? So unless you have it recorded in some way, you're going to lose that information in successive generations, which, by the way, is why we have the Bible, which has transcended all the generations. And so we have an accurate record in the Scripture itself of where we came from. And
we have accurate record in the Scripture of where we came from.
That record says, day 6, God created the great creatures. And later on day 6, God created Adam and Eve. So if that's true, then we'd have the great creatures, including the dinosaurs, created on the same day as Adam and Eve. That means we have dinosaurs and other, what we'd think of from fossils as extinct reptiles or whatever, alive all on that same day, together in history.
No millions of years required?
No, none of that in the Bible. And so when we see depictions of with the exact anatomy that we would know from fossils, then we're thinking to ourselves, okay, you know what? This kind of does fit what the Bible's been teaching all along. That God did create these creatures.
So dragons to Europeans was an Oriental concept, though, right? It was the far off places, the unfilled in places on the map. That's where dragons were. So Africa was just an Oriental place, same as Asia. In the Middle East, all of that to Europeans after the fall of Rome was just the Orient, just far off, and I shouldn't say to everybody, but I guess to the notion of wildlife, not to like politics and stuff. I'm sure that they were aware of trades with their neighbors and stuff, and that's exactly where these notions came from, right? Again, you don't have a full-size dragon, but you got people telling you there's full-size dragons, and they also got all these other weird creatures that you've never seen before. So you're like, sure, there's these, you see like a zebra striped, or a giraffe, and you're like, okay, these are weird looking creatures. These are striped horses and big giant spotted cow things and with long giant necks. Sure, if these exist, then why couldn't dragons exist too? So traveler's tales.
All the great creatures, in the beginning, alongside mankind, humankind, if you want to put it that way. And so that's what we see in some of this artwork. Okay, another one. Yeah. So years after that, I was able to go to Wales, and in Wales there's a place called St. David's Cathedral.
Here we go, Welsh
dragons. But this time I was looking at what they call a misericord, and it's a carving on the bottom of a flip-up bench. So the priest would stand for hours, and so they'd have these like little benches that they could flip down. They're on a hinge, and they could sort of lean their rear ends on these little benches as they're sort of lean/standing/leaning/ not quite sitting. Anyway, you flip them up, and you could see the bottom of them, and there's all kinds of carving in wood, beautiful oak carvings. One of them is none another sauropod dinosaur, and it's a spitting image of a sauropod dinosaur.
What Again, not an expert in the technical sense. What part of this is sauropod to you? Is it the oversized head with the cow-like ears? Is it the duck-like webbed feet? Or the serpentine tail swirling and curling underneath it? Or perhaps the tiny bat-like wings? Or the stomach that drags on the ground? Which parts of these do you think are dinosaur-like or sauropod-like? Because I'm telling you right now, none of them are. The only thing that's sauropod-like about this at all is that it has a long neck, but it'd need a longer, stouter neck to support a head like that.
And St. David's Cathedral. And you can just walk right up to it and take as many pictures of it as you want. So you can compare the anatomy of what we see in this carving with fossils. And it turns out that this one in St. David's matches an African sauropod fossil of a creature called Brachytrachelopan. And so this is...
Does it? Huh. Does it really? Its head sure looks small. Its feet sure do not look webbed. That tail is certainly not serpentine. That belly is not dragging on the ground. It has dorsal spines, not dorsal scutes. And no wings, obviously. No sauropod had wings. I don't have to tell the Hive that. You guys are a smart bunch of people out there, but good grief.
It's a short-necked, long neck. It was a relatively shorter neck.
Okay.
And it had a wide mouth. And boy, it just looks like that exactly. Now, it does have these little silly-looking wings, carved onto the sides. Totally functionless. They wouldn't have been able to lift anything compared to the large body size of
Functionless wings.
that.
Right.
So that's a separate question: is why would the ancient artist put wings on a dragon? I think the answer is not because he or she thought that it could fly or that it actually had wings anatomically, but if you look at medieval art as a whole, they stuck wings on all their dragons.
Right.
It was like an artistic.
Right. It's almost like dragons are a chimera of other organisms that are just exotic from far off lands. There's giant birds and giant. It wasn't just, they weren't just telling these traveler tales about reptilian creatures. There were giant tigers and all these weird and wild creatures in the far off reaches of the world. Crocodiles and ostriches and freaking even something. You see how terrible they were at depicting a camel, and that's just the normal pack animal from the region closest to Europe. And that's how they thought of them. Imagine what they could have envisioned when someone described sailing to some tropical island where there's Komodo dragons or other large monitors, or taking an expedition into Africa and running into some crocodiles or Nile monitors, and
expression or way of saying this here is a dragon, whether or not it actually had wings.
Standard issue wings.
Standard issue. So in other words, is that reasonable? Is it reasonable to think that the artist had first or second hand knowledge of how this animal looked? Well, how else do you explain the exact anatomical one-to-one match with everything except the wing?
Did you see any one-to-one match on that at all? Is it me? Is there something wrong with me?
Wings, the little bitty wing thing. So, I mean, it's got the right size and shape of feet, of legs, the right length of tail, right length of neck, the right width of the face. I mean, all of it matches what he or she should have had no knowledge of at all until paleontology, in the late 20th century. Which century was that?
20th century, 1900.
Oh, which century was that?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So we've got two great examples. It reminds me of in my own reading, read about Marco Polo, who wrote this book about his own travels, and in it he wrote about some creatures that he encountered that seemed very dragon-like. And when he brought it back, the book was actually nicknamed like The Million Lies or something like that, because everyone thought that he was just making stuff up. They're like, there's no way that any of this is real. But then after and even to his deathbed, he was like, nope, everything that I wrote down, this was real. This was real. And there's some stuff in there that could be questionable, but it comes out after the fact that after he died, when
There's a lot of things in there that are questionable, just saying.
more people actually went and traveled in the places that he traveled, they're actually like, wow, he was actually telling the truth about a lot of this. It's interesting to see. It's like that loss of knowledge that you had mentioned over time. And if you're not in the same geographical location, I mean, the Earth on an astronomical scale is not huge, but I mean, there's a lot of land here, and one person.
I speculate, or I shouldn't say it's my own speculation. I do think the theory that griffins, the lion eagle hybrid, were based on Protoceratops discoveries in Mongolia, and reconstructions of that maybe fed the folklore of the griffin.
Person back then couldn't travel everywhere and see all the things that there were to see. So
Right.
yeah,
That's interesting that you read that and studied that. Yeah. So he encountered what they would have called in China back then a long, and maybe that's why it's depicted on the Chinese zodiac, their calendar, even to this day.
Right.
And the calendar's several millennia old, and it's got a chicken, the year of the rat, the year of the tiger, the year of
just a little bit
and then
more
one of them is the year of the
whenever we
long.
go through it.
So why would you have a calendar system that has a series of known animals, and then you throw in a fictional animal that's like
It's funny because you hear the same argument from the Bigfoot people about the Native American spirit animals or whatever. They're like, oh, they had, the owl and the bear and the beaver, and then there's Sasquatch. So that means it's real because they depict it with the rest of the real animals that we know exist. It's like but we don't, and that's a problem. That's again colonizer mind, because we classify animals, scientifically now. But these people groups didn't have to, and they didn't. They're different, like black bears, for instance, in North America. The cinnamon-colored ones and the black ones and the brown ones. We know that those are all the same species and interbreed now. But at the time, they were different bears. That this bear was this bear, and that bear was that bear, and they were different. That's the way that they looked at creatures and animals and differentiated them. They had their own classification systems. Again, something we covered when we talked about the Amazonian big cats, because what color morph the jaguars and cougars came in would change what the natives would identify them as. So it's just our colonizer brains that say, hey, we gotta break that down and say, hey, okay, so they weren't classifying these scientifically, they were classifying them visually or even behaviorally.
doesn't match at all the theme.
Right.
Instead, it looks like, if we're keeping with the theme of animals, that the long would have been an animal alive at that time when the calendar was created.
But the way the long is described, though, is never anything like a physical creature, right? It's not an animal. The long is not an animal. It's a spiritual thing.
A sauropod alive at the time when St. David's, misericords were carved, or alive at that time when...
And there's no depiction of a long that looks like a sauropod either.
Bishop Bell was interred in the floor of the cathedral.
So we have these examples. I guess the question remains is, so if they did exist, if dragons were real, what happened between then and now? Where did they go? Because we don't see them walking around today.
We don't, and I kind of, half of me is like, oh man, they've gone extinct.
Right.
We're now missing the joy and the wonder of being able to see these creatures. But on the other hand, phew, we dodged the monster bullet.
That's right. That's right.
And we can let our kids play in the street without fear of them being eaten.
No way. We did not dodge any bullet. Monsters are awesome. Right, Gur? Gur? Are you going to do it? Maybe take a minute. Oh, well. It's supposed to play the audio clip. I guess it only happens once at stream. I don't know.
Right.
Except for coyotes, but that's another subject. But speaking of coyotes and wolves and bears, we're in Dallas, which used to be the home of buffalo, or we should call bison, bears. I live on Bear Creek Road. But there's no bears within 100 miles of here anymore.
Right.
So they've been extirpated or made extinct in this region. And so now they live elsewhere. Well, let's say you extirpate dinosaurs from this wetlands region, because they were wetland creatures, we're convinced, based on the fossils and the depictions. Okay. If you see these depictions, sometimes these... The ancient artists, most of them medieval European, put their dragons in a wetlands or a swamp or like a river system. So we know a few things about that. We know that in the 1800s, these kings were across Europe were draining the swamps and making new land habitable for more people.
Well, and that's true. And there was also climate change going on at the time. There's always climate change going on. I mean, I'm not going to say that the climate has ever been stable, but it's following its cycle. And at this time, it was what they called the medieval warm period. So yeah, we were the agricultural was in full bloom.
And what happens when you remove a creature's habitat?
It goes elsewhere where
It goes elsewhere where it dies. Like the bears. They're no longer here, even though we have names left over from when they were here. By the way, European places have names left over from when dragons were there. Like in Germany, they have the city named Worms. Well, they might pronounce it Worms or something different, but that
Verms.
it's just that's their ancient name for a long, slender reptile. And in France, they have place names like salamander, which doesn't mean the same thing as it does
today.
I talked about this on our reptilian video. So salamander and the folklore around salamanders. So salamanders are amphibians, and as I said earlier on this same show, I have a really soft spot for amphibians, and I know quite a bit about them. The folklore surrounding salamanders does relate to the actual animals that are salamanders, and lizards too, to a lesser extent, but mostly salamanders, because unlike frogs, salamanders can, well, I shouldn't say that unlike frogs, because frogs can do that too, but in toads as well. But salamanders hibernate under tree bark, right? They hibernate in fallen timber, in wood piles. So people would put their, and the reason I bring up frogs is because it's the frog in the boiling water scenario, right? It's you put the log in the fire with the salamander hibernated inside of it, and then you find a little burned up salamander in your fireplace, and it was thought that it was part of this this folklore, this magical creature, right? And sometimes the salamanders would crawl out of the burning logs, right? And that's even more, whoa, these are fire creatures crawling out of the burning logs. If you light a log on fire, it'll summon these burning little lizard things. And sometimes it was lizards too, but mostly it was salamanders. That's where we get the name from. And sometimes they'd even skitter out of the fire, on fire, and run across your living room. So yeah, that's where the folklore comes from on that. And so they became strongly tethered to the element of fire because we were finding them in our fireplaces, and they were crawling out of burning logs, sometimes on fire themselves.
Today, so back then, salamanders referenced reptiles, large.
I got to clarify that, yeah, and the idea that when they died, it was never because they were burning; it's because the fire went out, right? If they weren't engulfed in fire, they would die. It was the folklore.
Scary reptiles. And by the way, if you go to Chateau du Blois in the Blois Valley, this thing is covered with hundreds of carvings of what they used to call salamander. Doesn't look like anything like today's salamander, right? So, names and their meanings change over centuries. Mm-hmm. So I know I'm digressing. Sorry, I'm getting back to another example. It's a spitting image of a Plateosaurus that we know only from fossils. So what happened to them? Mm-hmm. Well, it was a hunting lodge built in the 1400s. Back then, their hunting lodges were castles.
Of all things, a Plateosaurus is so primitive to say it was this, because what Plateosaurus, that was what? It lived in the Jurassic, right? Plateosaurus lived. Yeah, and I guess they did live up to Plateosauria lived up until, but Plateosaurus specifically, which would be Plateosaurus elencardi, is Triassic. So Plateosaurus, we live closer to the time when like Tyrannosaurus and much closer, to be frank, to the time when like T-Rex and Triceratops and Brachiosaurus and all these giant dinosaurs, we live closer in time to them than they lived to Plateosaurus. Plateosaurus was in the Triassic, very, very ancient lineage of dinosaurs. They are primitive. They used to call them protosauropods. They don't call them that anymore. Prosauropods was also a popular terminology for them. And sauropodomorph was what they were described as basal. So it's weird that they would reach all the way back to the beginning, to the early radiation of Dinosauria and say, yeah, there's this early radiation of Dinosauria example in modern times. That's so weird. So weird and so, what's the word? Anachronistic?
For royalty.
Seems safe, yeah.
But what happened? Historically, we know that the Blois Valley was once wetlands, and they drained it, and now they farm it. So they've been farming it, for hundreds of years. Well, the dragons went away, because their habitat was gone. So that's the same reason why today's big creatures go extinct or get extirpated from one region. It's because people move in, drain the swamps. East Texas, just down the road, was a huge wetlands area, totally drained. They what's the word? Canalized the river systems here. The pioneers did, and so now it's completely different. I mean, it used to be packed with beavers.
Right. It used to be alligators and all kinds. East Texas used to be a lush wetland. That is true. It's unfortunate.
Beavers have moved away too. So anyway, climate change is another fact.
Basal, Basal. I don't know if I say it. I don't say it any different in my dialect. They're both pronounced the same. I guess basal is what the word would normally be, but I basil is what I say. But yeah, basil like the spice and basal like the organism. But to me, my tongue says it the same. It's just my dialect.
Factor that would remove habitat. And so when we talk about these dragons, what they used to call dragons,
right?
But some of them I think may have been dinosaurs. A lot of these proliferated in areas where it was once wetter. Mm-hmm. Well, when was it wetter in the Middle East? When was it wetter in tropical zones? And now it's desert today.
Right.
Well, it was wetter during the Ice Age. So the Ice Age.
Yeah. Well, and he's right here about the way that what happened to the to the Near East too, and to the Levant area. It dried out. That's what happened. Climate change wrecked it, and early agriculture. We learned what not to do. The Middle East was the testing ground. And it's really sad because it was once this hub where 3 continents met and 3 groups of indigenous wildlife converged too. Would have been a fantastic place, literal invernable Garden of Eden that they, as we cultivated it and domesticated it and drove all the wild creatures out, it turned into just this big wasteland. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
Lasted after the flood for several hundred years after the flood. The flood being 4,400 or so years ago. So
and obviously agriculture warfare played a hand in the state of the current state of the land too. Sowing salt and things like that was a very common practice of war in the Middle Ages.
You're talking about thousands of years ago, in the Middle East anyways, that there were wetlands back then in that place. Today it's desert, but it was wetlands and lots of rainfall that they don't get anymore.
Right.
And you can trace that in the scriptures too. For example, Genesis 12, Lot and Abraham look over this area, and it says that Abraham saw that it was a well-watered land, so Lot went there. Today it's a desert. I mean, it's a flaming furnace of dry,
yes.
Dry land. So anyway, all that to say,
I'm not disagreeing with that.
What are the 2 main factors that cause creatures to go extinct today? Well, it's habitat loss through A, climate change, and B, humans moving in.
Does ICR acknowledge climate change? I would love if there was a creationist organization out there that said, yes, climate change is a thing that's happening, it's anthropocentric, and we need to do something about it. I would love to see that. Allies!
And I think that's the same explanation it's the most responsible explanation to invoke for past extinctions also.
Right.
Are the same 2 that we see happening today. People move in, drain the swamps, get rid of, and the creatures have nowhere to go. So I think that's where they went. They went extinct.
Sad, but also not so sad since we don't have to deal with them. Like you said, it would be a very different world if we did have to deal with dinosaurs on the daily here in Dallas, Texas.
Right.
There's this weird notion that people have that, like, if we had dinosaurs today, that they would, like, and that's what the Jurassic World movies were all about too. The last movie was like, oh, the dinosaurs are in the human world and we can't coexist with them. And they're just animals. Why wouldn't, it's so weird, this idea that, oh, if there's this kind of animal in the wild that we can't coexist with it. I mean, we do that with animals we live with now too. Say, oh, we can't coexist with them, we got to extirpate them. But generally speaking, it would just be another species in the food chain.
Very different world, but awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that with me. So we do actually have a book here. It's called Dire Dragons.
Untold Secrets of the Planet. Okay. Yeah.
It's a beautifully illustrated book. It's got all sorts of information about dragon legends and dinosaurs and all of that. You can find it at our web store, icr.org/store.
Oh, honey, no. I mean, I would love to have that book. I would love to have that book. I would start a my own blog just to review that book. You all want to blog? Someone needs to buy me Untold Secrets of Planet Earth, the Dragon volume. But that was ICR, Institute of Creation Research, or Institute for Creation Research, talking about dragons, talking about talking about mythology, if you ask me, and trying to just basically shoehorn other people's culture into their own folklore to pretend that theirs is the one true story. All right, so if you're watching this on Wednesday, thank you so much for hanging out with us here on Creation Watch. Please do stick around the Hive, because Friday, go ahead hit that bell, because Friday we are doing another episode of CrypticCorner, and it's going to be awesome. And then Saturday morning, we'll be back live from the Hive. So remember to be kind and take care, and we'll see you next time.
A dragon lives in my garage. Yeah, yeah, yeah. With his unseen entourage. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He leaves no footprints, leaves no trace, as he floats around the place. He's invisible and you will never see his face. I've got a cat that walks through walls. Yeah, yeah, yeah. At least he did when he was small. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, my discorporated son, it's the privilege of the young to be unaware that it cannot be done. I know this world was made for me because it fits me perfectly. Anything that happens, happens, and it happens to me. I've got an artificial dog. Yeah, yeah, yeah. When he goes backwards, he's a god. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Maybe I should set him free. I could just chase him up the chimney, but it's late and I just haven't got it in me. I know this world was made for me because it fits me perfectly. Anything that happens, happens, and it happens to me.